Okay, hi guys, welcome to Biology Online with Henny van Vuren. Hi year 13s, I hope you're really well. I just wanted to do our next lesson on how we left Africa and ended up basically living all over the world. Okay, so there's basically at the moment two competing theories of how hominins left Africa. There's the Out of Africa theory that ties in very well with something that's called the Eve hypothesis. Now, please note both of these are theories. We don't have actual evidence, but we are putting together the puzzle as we are learning more. And we hypothesize that Homo sapiens developed only in Africa and then spread out from Africa. Whereas we have the multi-region theory, which opposes that, and the hypothesize that Homo sapiens simultaneously developed across the old world. And the old world is basically Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. So, who left first? The first guy to ever leave was our friend Homo erectus, and he left, so the first hominins to leave was about 1.9 million years ago. Homo ergaster was the guy who came just before him, and he evolved, we currently think, into Homo erectus. The main migration corridor occurs through what is today called the Levantine corridor. Okay, and the Levantine corridor is basically where the top of Egypt crosses over into the Middle East, and I will show you a little video I made earlier just to put it more in perspective of where in the world we are. Then also, I just said the dispersal of Homo erectus then happened throughout the old world, in other words, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And lastly, there was a second move where a dispersal of archaic This dispersal of Homo erectus then created some archaic forms of Homo, of the genus Homo in those areas, such as Homo neanderthalis and Homo devisinosus. So here's the little video I made, and you can see that's our science block as seen from space, and there's SC24 is that blue marker, so you're in my class, so here we go. Okay guys, I want to take you on a virtual tour, just to give you an idea where in the world all these things happened, and to put it in a little bit of a perspective of how humans could have possibly come out of Africa. So, as you can see here, this is the science block, and that is SC24, so you're in my virtual classroom right under there. Okay, and obviously that is in a little place called Auckland, and Auckland is part of a country called New Zealand. And then as we zoom out, we are going to be traveling towards Africa. Okay, so on our way. Hello my motherland, tell me how you're doing. Hello Africa. I don't know if you know that song. Anyways, down here is where I was born and grew up. And then if we go and look, you will remember the Great Rift Valley that she went to. I really hope that you watched that documentary I asked you to watch, where at that stage was the oldest human remains. There has been older remains found recently, but it is in Ethiopia, and you can see the Great Rift Valley is right over there. Okay, and it is this rip basically over here in the continent. Now, interesting, the Gate of Grief, which she also covered, which was we believe the second exit from Africa, could have been that when the sea levels was a lot smaller, they could have made it across, or not smaller but lower. But anyways, we'll come back to that. So from there, the Out of Africa hypothesis is basically, if you look, here's Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Lebanon, Cyprus, and Turkey up there. And Egypt actually straddles both Africa and then across, and right here, this part of the world also still belongs to Egypt. and right there is where the Suez Canal is. And so basically Egypt comes right across, and this is called the um, Levantine Corridor, okay, which basically the idea was that when we had the cooling of the Sahara, and then basically the Homo sapiens could get through here, that they traveled up, and then over here is Eshkul, which is the cave where those remains were found that she documented. And at that stage, when she made that document, it was the oldest human remains outside of, what do you call it, outside of Africa. 10 graves, basically, and it is right here in Israel. But as you've heard, we think that unfortunately that line did not continue. So there had to be a second exit, and this is very much in line with the out of Africa proposal. So if we go from Eshul and we go back to the Gate of Grief, and remember the Great Rift Valley is right over there, we go back to the Gate of Grief, and she basically said they might have crossed over here. From there, she took us to that beautiful green, like oasis place, which was in Oman, and it is this valley in Oman where then there was, there's currently waterfalls and all kinds of amazing things in this place where you just don't associate it, because if you look all around, there's desert everywhere. However, she mentioned that from where the current coast is, the sea levels was a lot lower, and about 50 kilometers in was still sea level, and that's where some freshwater springs were, so that the ancient Homo sapiens could travel across here. And then eventually, when you go from Dhofar, you go to the Gulf of Oman, and the Gulf of Oman with the low sea levels was apparently land, so a very lush valley, and they could cross over here, and from here you're basically moving from Oman into Iran, and then Pakistan, and eventually India you could travel down, but because all these green belts, you could just go straight through, and there up there is Punjab, where a lot of our Sikh friends are from, traveling across, and eventually you could get to Southeast Asia. And if you think about Homo florensis, he was found in Indonesia, in one of these islands, and then they could travel further along through Papua New Guinea, and remember again, sea levels were a lot lower, and hence how they made their way into Australia. And we have the Melanesians, not the Polynesians, but the Melanesians, and also there's some Papua New Guineans are called Melanesians, and then also some of them went to Fiji and so forth. Whereas the Polynesians, we believe that they actually came all the way down from Taiwan, which is down here, and made their way down, and there's the Marshall Islands and so forth, Baker Island, Kiribati, further down there's Fiji, Niue, Cook Islands, French Polynesia, and eventually the last place that they discovered was lovely New Zealand, the place we call home. Okay, I just wanted to put it in a global perspective for you. Thanks for watching. Bye. Now, you just saw where the Levantine corridor is, and again, this was the out here and around, so you have the Mediterranean Sea over there, today Egypt, Israel, Jericho, Jerusalem is over here, Tel Aviv is further down there-ish, Syria, today's Iraq, there's Saudi Arabia, there's Kuwait, there's Iran, and so forth. So I hope this puts it in perspective for where we are. And you can see the Nile River as it's emptying into the sea there. Okay, so what happened? Homo erectus, 1.8, 1.9 million years ago, said, I've had enough of Africa, here we go. And they went to Western Europe. And in Western Europe, he developed into archaic forms of Homo, and or Homo sapiens, and in this case, Homo antecessor. Okay. What happened also in Europe then, and you can see this was 800,000 years ago, and then 200,000 years later, Homo heidelbergensis basically evolved in Europe and developed into Homo neanderthalis and then Homo denisova. And Homo denisova is more towards Asia, whereas Homo neanderthalis is more towards Europe. Okay, then we have archaic forms of Homo sapiens in Africa. So, well, meanwhile, back in Africa, Homo erectus was still there. Not all of them left. If you think about it, it's basically a founder effect, and not all of the Homo erectuses would have left. So, in Africa, they evolved as well, and about 1 million years after Homo erectus, we had Homo antecessor, and then 200,000 years after that, we have Homo heidelbergensis. So this all occurred in Africa. So when you then think about it, 300,000 years ago, Homo antecessor, which, as I just mentioned, 800,000 years ago got onto the scene, and then 500,000 years later shows up Homo sapiens. And then Homo sapiens has about 100,000 years of walking around Africa, and then it basically migrates out of Africa for the first time. So all the archaic forms of Homo are now outcompeted and became extinct. What does that mean? It means that as Homo sapiens leaves and enters Europe, he encounters other Homo species, but they become extinct, and we have evidence that they actually were assimilated into Homo sapiens, basically, because there was a little bit of interbreeding going on there between Neanderthalis and Divinosa and Homo sapiens. Okay, so that is the out of Africa hypothesis. So again, we have the 1.8, 1.9 million years ago. Homo erectus says, okay, Africa, I'll see you later, and he goes to Europe. And Homo erectus, some of them said, okay, I'll see you later, I'm going to Asia. And they developed basically and went through evolution, and we have archaic forms of Homo sapiens. And about 500,000 years ago, these archaic Asian species became extinct, and the European species became extinct. And it says here that there was little or no gene flow between the European archaic, the Asian archaic, and then of course the bunch of Homo erectus that stayed behind in Africa, and there was obviously a lot more of them. So they developed, and they actually survived. And then there was a second wave, and this second wave, some modern Africans remained back in Africa. Homo sapiens remained there, and some went to Europe, and some went to Asia. And this second wave is where Homo sapiens then exits Africa. Not Homo erectus anymore, but Homo sapiens. And there were two waves of that as well. I'll tell you about that later. But the second wave was the successful one, and we know that it was about, according to DNA studies, about 200 people. So if you're not from Africa, if you're from Europe or Asia, it was literally 200 Homo sapiens that that gave rise to the rest of the world. So genetic variation a lot lower if you think about it, due to founder effect. Anyway, so it basically, the Edith hypothesis says that all modern humans can trace their evolutionary heritage to a single woman via changes in the mitochondrial DNA. We'll talk about that a little bit more. This woman lived in Africa about 200,000 years ago. The descendants of this population of modern humans dispersed throughout the world to the rest of the world, displacing all other hominins in existence at the time. Okay, so First Homo erectus, the European and the Asian Homo erectus, and their evolutionary offspring, if you want to call it that. They got extinct, but in Africa, Homo erectus survived and eventually developed into Homo sapiens, and then Homo sapiens left and conquered the world. So there's two waves. So wave number one, 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus leaves Africa and spreads population across Africa, Asia and Europe, evolving into a number of hominin. There was no gene flow between Africa, Europe, or African Asian populations. In other words, none of the Europeans went back to Africa, none of the Asians went back to Africa, and none of the Asians or Europeans met each other, and so there was no gene flow. Approximately 300,000 years ago in the southern Africa, Homo sapiens evolved. Okay, that's where we find some of the first evidence of that happening. Then in wave number two, and this was the only successful one, the first one, which was at between 100 and 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens then left Africa and began an outward expansion into the continents, replacing other hominin forms to become the sole remaining species. In southern Europe, Homo sapiens replaced Homo neanderthalis, and in Asia, Denisovan. So, assumptions for this, that the oldest Homo sapien fossils should be found in Africa, and that is the truth. It also assumes that African populations of Homo sapiens will show more genetic diversity as they've had the most time to develop this diversity through mutation. And that is also the truth. If you look at the African population, amongst Africans there's a lot more genetic variation. They have many more alleles of the same genes in comparison to people who are not from African descent, and that is because that as the small group of Homo sapiens left, they had founder effect, so they took with them a very small portion or sample of the total Homo sapiens genetic variation at that stage. Does that make sense? We talked about founder effect a lot in year 12. Then non-African populations should have less diversity as they've had less time to develop these differences, and they started off with a smaller gene pool because of founder effect. And then this is also then seen. So, and it also says that a low genetic diversity should be seen because overall Homo sapiens are a very young species, and that is also the truth. If you compare two chimpanzees, they are the same species, but genetically they have so much more variation between them than what we do, because chimpanzees have been chimpanzees for possibly millions of years, whereas we have only shown up about 300,000 years ago. So consequently we've had a lot fewer mutations, and a lot fewer mutations means lower genetic diversity. So here's some more support for the out of Africa hypothesis. So genetic analysis. Yeah, so the oldest Homo sapiens fossils are found in Africa. The greatest genetic variation in Homo sapiens is in African populations. That's modern populations. Less diversity in people that went elsewhere. Genome analysis from Homo neanderthalis and comparisons with that of Homo sapiens indicate a divergence from a common ancestor about 500,000 years ago. So that's where we split, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis. However, genome analysis of Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis compared to Homo denisovans, or the denisovans, indicate a divergence from a common ancestor about 1 million years ago. And at least two waves of dispersal of Homo sapiens from Europe into Asia, and we can read more about the denisovans. Okay. Then the mitochondrial DNA analysis support the out of Africa theory, which is the Eve hypothesis. They carried out mitochondrial DNA. So that's actually DNA that exists in the mitochondria. It's not carried in the nucleus. So mitochondria actually have their own DNA. And you can only find this mitochondrial DNA in eggs. You don't find them in sperms. So it is only inherited from the mother. This DNA of the mitochondria does not undergo meiosis. It undergoes mitosis, which means there's no crossing over and no recombination of maternal and paternal DNA. So it means that the only changes that can happen with that is when it goes through mutation. Because the way that we make a new mitochondria inside the cell is basically through mitosis, in abbreviated commas. So it does not go through meiosis because you don't have mitochondrial little sperms swimming around and so forth. You understand what I mean? You don't have two mitochondria mating with each other to make a new mitochondria. They simply divide. Now, the analysis of that said that all humans have a common female ancestor, and she lived in southern Africa about 200,000 years ago, and that is from that mitochondrial DNA. So just this part, genetic analysis of the mitochondrial DNA verifies the greater genetic diversity is in populations current day in sub-Saharan Africa. We talked about that, so they have more alleles, again because they did not undergo founder effect. And the more distant they became from Africa, the lower the genetic variation amongst these Homo sapiens. So it's used to track outward migration. But anyways, it all comes back to this single ancestor. A mutation in the Y chromosome for the males is found in all males and can be traced back to a single male 60,000 years old. And where did he live? In Africa. Okay, so that is all support for the out of Africa theory. Now, the multi-regional hypothesis is a little bit less accepted, but we still learn about it. So this theory is based on fossil evidence and then also anatomical characteristics. In other words, why do Europeans look so different from Africans, look so different from Asians? And the idea behind that is that we all developed basically from Homo erectus, and we had gene flow between us all the time, which meant that we shared the alleles around, and overall we are the same, but we look so different because we developed in these different areas. Now, again, I'm not convinced about this, because if you think about it, skin color, just one thing, is only 12 genes out of our 60,200 genes in every cell. So it really is, but let's look at it further. So basically, about 1.8, 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus said, okay, Africa, I'll see you later. And some of them went into Europe, and some of them went into Africa, or remained in Africa, and some of them went into Asia. And then some of the Asian Homo erectuses would mate with African Homo erectuses and bring some of those genes back. Some of the Europeans would meet some of the Asians, and they would mate and change genes, and you know what I mean. So there's gene flow all the time between the African groups, the European groups, and the Asian groups. And as we go further, we then get European archaic Homo sapiens and African archaic Homo sapiens and Asian archaic Homo sapiens, and there's still gene flow between them, and eventually we have the modern Homo sapiens that shows up, and they are all Homo sapiens but very distinct from each other because they developed in these different areas. Okay, so they all developed into Homo sapiens at the same time, basically. But it assumes that all present-day human populations should show the same amount of genetic variation, which is not true, because these populations were established at the same time and were subject to the homogenizing, which means equal mixing effect of gene flow for the same amount of time. And then intermediate fossils found between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens should be found outside of Africa, such as Neanderthalis, Heidelbergensis, and so forth. Now we're talking simply about Homo sapiens. So forget about Homo erectus. Now it's only modern humans, or Homo sapiens. So there was two exits again. The first, we know that they developed in around about southern Africa, Classes River mouth or Border Cave, and slowly but surely they migrated up into Africa. And during this time there was global cooling, not global warming, but global cooling, which meant suddenly the Sahara Desert was no longer a desert, and they could travel through here, and they had an opportunity to survive where we today would not, because it's a desert. And eventually the first group came out and they settled here in what is called the Fertile Crescent, or then the Levantine Corridor, but that was not successful apparently. Okay, so they died out. And then about between 50 and 55,000 years ago, another group left, so we don't know where from, must have been up high, and basically started going across into Asia and across into Europe eventually. But Europe was only settled later. So you can see here that here they are, so basically the first ones didn't make it, but then a second group, and they traveled all along here, and we have 50,000 years ago we have evidence in Indonesia. We also have Flores, which is down here with the Hobbit, and then 50,000 years ago in Australia, and then some of the Melanesians went to Fiji, and then also don't forget that into Asia, and some of the Asians into Taiwan, and from Taiwan all the way down we go Hawaii, all the Polynesian islands, and down into New Zealand, as little as I think it's 800 years ago. Again, when you then look at, there's Australia about 50,000 years ago. The first modern humans in Europe only arrived there about 40 to 35,000 years ago. Asia in China was as early as 67,000 years ago. Okay, sorry, my voice just caved in there, so let's see if I can make it through the rest. It was global cooling. So what was happening is that the water in the oceans were receding. They were being pulled into the ice caps. So the ice was a lot more, which held the water, which meant that that our sea levels was a lot lower. The opposite is happening today, as our ice caps are melting, releasing all that water, and then the water is coming back, and actually like Kiribati is a big problem at the moment. Anyways, yeah, so that's why also some people think that the second wave of humans crossed over here, and not through that corridor there. At that time, the early Asians would have seen that the Bering Strait was connected, and there wasn't water between Alaska and Russia. So the first Americans arrived about 30,000 to 15,000 years ago. They then spread down, all the way down, down, and eventually back up. So that explains, I think, to a lot of people why the Inuits of Canada and Alaska look so similar to, and if you look at them, a lot of them have Asian characteristics, and also they look very similar to the northern tribes here in Russia and so on. Talked about Polynesia already, so from Taiwan, Polynesians came down as little as 800 years ago in New Zealand, and this over here was Melanesia, so that is Fijians basically coming across from there. Alright, so that was an idea of the landmass back then, with the low sea, so you can see there's even a connection still with Tasmania, so there was more land. But it's all you need to know is in Australia, evidence shows about 50,000 years ago. Flores, which is an island that went through miniaturization, so there we go. So maybe a descendant of Homo erectus that survived because of the isolation. And yeah, there was between 95,000 and as recent as 13,000 years ago. And there's also on this island, there's giant rats, but there's also pygmy elephants, which is the cutest. I showed you them. So he was really, really small, only 1 meter tall. But yeah, quite a recent discovery as well. That is where we call it a day. Thank you guys for watching all the way through. I hope you have a great day. Thank you. Bye.